Good. Hello there, Brid. Really nice to see you. For those of you who don't know, or because I haven't actually said it so far this morning, good morning, everyone. My name is Sharon Lever, and I am the Principal Social Worker for Adults in East Sussex County Council. On my screen, I can see a tiny picture still of Nicola McGowan, who, as I say, is the Principal Social Worker for Children's. And now it's with great pleasure I also would like to say hello and happy World Social Work Day to Professor Bridget Featherstone, and thank you very much for joining us today. It's really very nice to see you. I'm just going to find my info. Yeah, in welcoming Professor Featherstone, Brid, as we've established she likes to be called. She's come to us today, joining us from the University of Huddersfield, and is where she is the Professor of Social Work. Today, as we've said, we know the subject that Brid is going to speak on, but what I really like and really look forward to hearing from her about is that a way of changing the conversation about the role of economics, of poverty and inequality in the lives of the people that we work with and the people that we support through the process of social work and social care. So on that basis, I'm going to say good morning, Brid, and over to you, if that's okay, please.
That's great. Thanks, Sharon. And can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay?
Definitely hear you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a real pleasure to be with you today and to continue, actually, in some ways, some of the work I've been doing with Nicola and her colleagues and relationships we've been building over the last while around the subject of poverty. I want to start by just explaining how I'm going to present today. A few weeks ago, I broke my wrist, which is really frustrating and disabling. But being a typical academic, as my friends say, I've used it as a chance to learn a lot more about myself and our society and how I cope with disability and disabling environments. So it's not been all bad. It's actually been a learning experience. But the net result, and this is a funny thing, my mother used to always say it's a nil wind that doesn't blow some good. I've had to change my presentation style. And so normally I would be presenting you with a PowerPoint and I'd be talking through that PowerPoint. And last week when I was teaching the students, I realized that my PowerPoint wasn't really up to standard because my typing's so bad, and that I would have to just talk to them and use the PowerPoint that I developed for myself as a bit of a prompt. And you know what? They wrote to me at the end of the week and said it had been such a fantastic session and they'd learned so much from it. And I realized that I have been maybe doing a bit of death by PowerPoint, to be honest. So I am going to talk directly to you with my slides as a prompt, if that's okay. And what I've agreed with Jackie and Abby is that I will tidy up these slides and there are references on them, and that they will be available to you in a few weeks' time. But also you can contact me at any point through my email to ask for further references. So what I'm going to talk to you about is how we can have hopeful and helpful conversations about poverty across the life course. And I'm going to start by if you like, reflecting on the day that's in. Now I'm going to do a little bit of juggling, and like Sharon, I'm going to get a bit nervous about whether I can do this. So can you still see me okay and everything and hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay. So first of all, like you all, I want to reflect on the day that's in it. And, it's a reasonably recent development that we've started celebrating World Social Work Day. And it's been part of a process in social work where, after a lot of battering in the press, etc., we have been really thinking about our culture and our profile and looking after ourselves as well as looking after those we work with. And I want to start with thinking about the word world, because I actually think that's a really important one for me. And I think I've been as guilty as anyone else over the years of being quite insular and focusing on in my case, child protection and what happens in England and what the government are doing or not doing. And I have noted at times, oh, well, child protection wags the social work dog, and that's not fair. And actually, social work is about much more than child protection, and it's different in different parts of the world. And on a day like today, I'm really reminded of that as I think about our colleagues across the world in their different settings, whether it's doing group work or community work or advocacy, working in communities across the world. Often in dire situations of poverty. And I want to think about them today and to think about often the inspiration that many provide for thinking differently and lifting our heads up above the world we currently occupy and helping us to think, oh, it could be different. Because I think that that might be something I want us to think about today, about how we might do things a bit differently when confronted with the challenge of poverty. There is also, for me, something about our history as a profession. And some of you, maybe you're too young, but there will be some people I know who will remember Professor Olive Stevenson, who was a very inspirational woman professor who died a few years ago and was one of the first professors of social work, and exemplifies many of the themes of today in her life, because actually her first work was really about, like, she was on the Maria Caldwell inquiry back in 1972, that tragic death that led to so much of the child protection procedures that we know of today. And she actually wrote a minority report then about, she disagreed with the majority and became really well known for developing very thoughtful analyses and critiques of how social workers did or didn't deal with neglect, and really avoided binaries, avoided the idea that it was all about poverty or it was nothing to do with poverty, and really counselled a reflective form of social work. But as her career progressed and as she got older herself, developed some fantastic work on aging and reflections on the life course. And but I just wanted to give you a little quote from her to help us to anchor ourselves today. She said, "I would like social workers to give a little bit more time to history. How did we get here? What have we lost in the process? What's been gained? It sometimes seems to me that we are caught up in a dreadful world of happenings, crises, and instant communications. And there is a loss of collective wisdom of a sense of continuity, which gives a framework to understanding current behaviour." I've paraphrased her a little there. But for me, that's very important in terms of anchoring ourselves today, because our history is rooted in working with people in poverty. Our profession really had its origins in many ways in the Industrial Revolution and in the terrible conditions that were evident in our cities post-industrialization, where workers visited families primarily at that point to assess what was happening for children, but actually, as the history books show, gave a great deal of support to women who were being harmed at the time as well. So there was one branch of our work that was about inspecting families, and there was a big debate about whether that was about controlling people in poverty or helping them in poverty. There was another branch of our work which was in the settlement movement, which was about developing housing and places, community bases for people to come and get advice on education, get educated, get meals, get support, a more family support orientation. And there have been tensions around our profession from the start. Are we about care or control? And many people, including myself, I would say at times, have tried to straddle that divide by interpreting our mandate as being about in the process of caring and supporting, we sometimes do have to control, and nowhere is that more obvious than in work around domestic abuse or elder abuse, where we are protecting people and controlling some people's behaviours in order to support the family and the person who's been impacted. So, but it is a tension, and we straddle it in a very kind of like uncomfortable way and uneasy way at times. And it is a tension that we will be returning to in relation to how we work with poverty. So to today, mindful of Olive's injunctions that we don't get caught up in today as if it's something completely new, this cost of living crisis that we're in. I mean, I think it was Nicola who said to me recently, do you know what, for some people, this isn't a crisis, it's an emergency and it's business as usual, but just worse than what's happened before. Because for the last 10 or so years, we have been experiencing really a whole range of developments across our politics and our economics that have meant that people's lives have been steadily deteriorating. But it's, as COVID indeed showed us, these things are not equal. It's not an equal opportunity crisis, just as COVID was not an equal opportunity virus. This awful time we're living in is experienced differently by different groups of people, and that it feeds into and exacerbated already existing fault lines, and those fault lines are around class. The energy crisis has been different for different groups of people in different classes, very different for different genders, ethnicities, disabilities, and these things aren't simple categories. I'm a woman, but I'm also from a class, I have an ethnicity, I have or haven't got a disability, and I'm of a particular age. And they come together to inform how we experience the world. How we saw that so vividly during COVID. It was a global storm, but we absolutely were not in the same boat. The people who died were inevitably the poorest people. They were predominantly from minority ethnic backgrounds, not exclusively, obviously, but the death rate among people from minority ethnic backgrounds was disproportionate. And that was linked to the fact that many worked on frontline occupations, couldn't afford to protect themselves from infection. They had to go to work and they were living in overcrowded housing. So a range of things came together to make some people extremely vulnerable and to make some other people feel very protected. So for those of us who locked down in nice houses and gardens and had rooms to work in, whilst we might have felt lonely and isolated from our colleagues, we experienced life very differently from a mother trying to keep her children safe in a high-rise block, or from the families that we know spent lockdown in bed and breakfast accommodation, sharing cooking facilities, so therefore being really not able to protect themselves from sources of infection and indeed safeguarding issues. And there's been a lot of work done around how COVID impacted differently across different parts of our society. Today, when we think about poverty, actually, I think there are some problems with how we understand it. And so I am moving on to the hopeful and helpful, don't worry, but I do want to open up some of the obstacles to how we can have hopeful and helpful conversations around poverty. And I think there are problems with understanding at a general level. First of all, I think there is a real tendency in our society to not to think across the life course and to pit the generations against each other. How often do we hear this? Oh, the boomer generation, of which I'm probably one, a little younger than the people that they're really talking about. The boomer generation are alleged to have it all. They had free education, they've been able to buy their own houses, and they're now retiring on these lovely pensions. Well, that is true to an extent, but old people are not a homogenous category. Within the older population, there are fault lines around class, crucially around gender, as we see in terms of access to the state pension and the way the changes have impacted upon women from different groups, from occupational groups, so unfairly. And there are very rich younger people who will be coming out of university with no debt and who will be able to buy, with the help of mum and dad, the bank of mum and dad, a nice house. So, but we do have a tendency to divide and rule. And so that is a problem with thinking about how poverty is experienced across the life course and experienced in a dynamic and holistic way. And the other thing is that sometimes our research can be siloed. So whilst the Child Poverty Action Group will produce great research about children, and Age UK will produce great research about older people, sometimes we can forget that these people are all living in the same families. That poor children, as I'll show in a minute, are likely to have poor grandparents. Poor grandparents are likely to have poor to be looking after children in contexts that they didn't choose themselves whilst holding down jobs, and other grandparents will have very different experiences of being a grandparent. The other thing, as you know only too well, the siloed nature of our services makes it difficult to understand what is going on for families intergenerationally and across the life course, and all the complexities attached to that. I have a little example of that. So and just to give you some stats, because it wouldn't be a good presentation without just saying, you know, whilst there are 13.4 million people living in poverty, and whilst 3.9 million of them are children, there are 1.7 million pensioners living in poverty, according to the same stats. 1 in 6 of us today are in persistent poverty. 1 in 6 of those in poverty are in persistent poverty. Poverty, that means that they've spent at least 3 out of the last 4 years in poverty. And of course, for young children, that could be their whole life. There are particular issues for families with a disability, either a parental or a carer disability or a child's disability. And there are particular issues, as you know only too well, attached to being a carer in those contexts, or in a context of somebody being older. So poverty is across the life course, and it isn't concentrated in one group of people. And there have been groups of pensioners protected by government policies, but actually we do need, as I've said, to think. And what I will make a plea for us today is to connect the dots across the life course, and to make connections with other disciplines, and to make connections with other groups of people who are trying to understand what's going on. And I'm going to talk about the contribution that intersectionality can make to that, and a public health approach can make to that. And hopefully I can make this clear. So intersectionality, some of you are familiar with things like the social graces that people talk about. Intersectionality is another way of thinking about this. And it comes from the States, from the US, from Black women who were arguing right back in the 80s that, you know, that the campaigns by white feminists didn't always meet their needs. They were particularly concerned with understanding how domestic abuse impacted them, and what they wanted from the police, and what they wanted from services, and how they sought help. And what they were arguing there was, as Black women who experienced racism and who experienced poverty, they didn't always feel that they could call for help from a police force that would just lock up their men, and because the police were so racist. It's an interesting day today to be talking about the police, and to be thinking about the police as we try and digest Lady Casey's report on the Metropolitan Police, which I think proves to us the need for an intersectional approach, that we really, really need to see how policing and our services are experienced by different groups of people who experience racism and poverty and intersecting inequalities. They won't always experience us in the same way, and they won't always have the same needs in terms of help seeking, and they may want to seek help from each other and from trusted sources of support that they don't see as racist or as homophobic, etc. So intersectionality is a huge movement now, and it has developed as a way of understanding social problems, but also as a way of challenging them and transforming them. And it's both a practice as well as an understanding. And we will be coming back to looking at that. If you're interested, and it'll be in my profile, I'm doing a really exciting piece of work funded by Nuffield with a whole range of colleagues on how we're using intersectionality to understand and domestic abuse, but it's not just about understanding it, it's also about doing. So we're talking about thinking differently in relation to domestic abuse, using intersectionality and using an understanding around how poverty is experienced intersectionally, and we're using it to think about doing differently in terms of how we might transform our services. And there's loads of resources on the RIP website if you're interested in following that up or in contacting me. That would be great. So just to give you an example of usefulness of work from public health. So to sum up around intersectionality, we need to be wary of categories: old people, women, men, children. Those categories are all intercut by inequalities, and there are fault lines attached to all those inequalities, which mean that both the problems people experience, how they experience them, and what they want from services may be different. And so to give public health people really grasp this in a lot of ways. They don't obviously develop the practices we do. But we're used to thinking in silos, like people have mental health, people have domestic abuse, people have drug addiction. And when they come together, we talk about them as multiple problems. But we often have services that deal with them differently, although I know there are attempts now to join these up. But actually, we need to think in a different sort of way, and we need to think about the life course. So if we start with the child in Blackpool, who is more than 10 times more likely, according to our research, to come into care than a child in the most affluent bit of London. So we take that child and we really engage with their life. We will see that that child is much more likely to have asthma, is much more likely to have experienced the death of a parent by suicide, or a parent with mental health issues, a parent on prescription drugs for anxiety or depression, a parent with disability, to have lost a grandparent much earlier than her equivalent in Kensington. And that so there will be a lot of loss and trauma within families that is linked to illness and disability and experiences of early loss. Public health obliges us to make the connections between, so it's not just that the child is much more likely to come into care and that their individual parent is more likely to have not been able to care for them. It's that it's part, he is part of a community where those things are happening across that community. And we need to think about that in a different way than thinking about that as this individual family with these individual problems that are manifest as symptoms around drinking too much or being violent or whatever. Public health approach tells us about the usefulness of what's called the social gradient. The social gradient is like a ladder. At its most basic, the poorer are, the more likely you are to die earlier than your affluent counterpart, the more likely you are to experience a shortened old age in illness. You're more likely you are to experience mental health, and the more likely you are to experience a whole range of social problems. But it isn't just about the poor versus the rest, those in deprived areas versus the rest. Actually, it is a ladder. At every step level of deprivation, at every increase in deprivation rates, those things start to happen. So it's like, so we show that when we talked about the in our Child Welfare and Equalities project, when we talked about the likelihood of a child in Blackpool being more likely to be 10 times more likely to be in care than a child in Wokingham, we also showed how every step level in deprivation increased care rates, and we showed that visually with a ladder. So public health obliges us to stop thinking in terms of just families with individual problems and symptoms, and to think about generations, to think about the life course, and to think about these things in a more collective way. And so I'm making a plea for us to join the dots within individual families and within communities. Why are we always visiting the same estates? Why are we always seeing the same families at different points of the life course? And to make the connections in relation to particular parts of our local authorities where vulnerabilities cluster and deprivation clusters, and different parts of the life course, and how those things impact, so that that grandparent who is looking after that child who can't live with the parent may also be experiencing a whole range of vulnerabilities around their own health, around trying to keep a job down, around a disability, and trying to think about those services across the piece. So, poverty-aware practice. What is it? Well, in the light of the theme of thinking internationally, it is pertinent to reflect on the fact that actually the most developed example of poverty-aware practice comes from Israel, from the work of Michal Krumer-Nevo. And interestingly, the Israeli government has been one of the few governments that's invested in poverty-aware practice and put actual financial resources into training social workers, into giving them budgets, and has also commissioned Michal to develop this awareness program and to also evaluate it. It's quite complex and there's loads of work around it now. Some of us have been talking to our colleagues, not just in Israel, but also in places like Belgium and in New Zealand and in Norway. And we have a Child Welfare and Equalities network that we've set up to try and think about this work across. We've been developing it in relation to child protection, but I hope to show that it is absolutely applicable across the life course. And basically, at its heart is it starts from an understanding of what poverty is. So it sees poverty in line with a lot of other work that's been done, like the work of Ruth Lister in this country and Child Poverty Action Group, founder Peter Beresford. So it's not just about a lack of material and social capital. It's not just about money. It is also about all the things that are associated with income. It's about housing, education, health, connectedness, the ability to be able to join in things, the ability to be able to invite people for a cup of coffee, to go out for a cup of coffee, the ability for your children to go on school trips, the ability for your children to be able to be included in the life of their friends. There's a very strong connection between deprivation, poverty, and loneliness. And as we know, loneliness is the not so silent killer. This statistic has been critiqued and debunked, but there is a statistic that argues that chronic loneliness is as bad for you as smoking 20 cigarettes a day. Now, it's a kind of critiqued statistic, but it does help us to think about the fact that loneliness is both associated with poverty. It's not completely associated with poverty, but it's linked to poverty, the inability to be able to make connections because you just don't have the money. But loneliness in turn breeds the poverty of connection and exacerbates existing ill health and makes people ill health. But it's also, and Ruth Lister has written a lot about this, it's also about the very important, profound issues around shame. The research suggests that across every country in the world that's been studied, poverty is experienced as shameful. Although it is different in different countries depending on how generous their welfare state is and how different their values are, but it is also shaming, that you see yourself as shameful, but you also experience other people as seeing you as shameful. And we've just been through 30 years of a kind of settlement that's argued very strongly. And even last week in the budget, Jeremy Hunt repeated this, that independence is the goal, that if you're not independent, you are somehow failing as a human being. There is a character flaw to you, and that so therefore all of us who get ill, all of us who feel vulnerable, all of us who need other people to look after us, are therefore made to feel there is something wrong with us. And so, but poverty is about othering. It's often about a lack of voice. Crucially, often poverty policy is made by people who haven't experienced poverty themselves, who don't understand it, and who also don't honour and regard and respect the experience that people in poverty develop, the knowledge they develop of how to live, how to make the best of circumstances, how to live good lives, how to live respectful lives. And thus, we often, from afar, those of us not in poverty, make decisions or judgments about people's choices and decisions that may be ill-informed. So when we see somebody doing certain things, we may judge those things as irrational, like smoking or drinking or whatever. And they may be actually, we don't really get to understand or talk or engage with why they're doing what they're doing and how it's helping them to make sense of their lives and to do the best they can in the circumstance they are. And the ATD Fourth World, which is an organisation of people living in poverty and done a lot of training with social workers over the years. It's an international organisation, works across the world for social justice for people in poverty, but has a very strong training element and is has done a lot of work with Royal Holloway in London around training social workers. It has done research, which was obviously led by people in poverty themselves, and it identified poverty in terms of 6 dimensions. And before I go into them, I just want to tell you, kind of give some quotes from the people who were involved in this research. They talked about poverty. Poverty kills dreams and cages the dreamers. Poverty is not being able to smell the flowers because the stress of life gets in the way. Poverty means being part of a system that leaves you waiting indefinitely in a state of fear and uncertainty. They're the negatives. They're the things about the hopes, aspirations, and crucially, this issue about time, how poor people's time is never regarded in the same way. So people are left waiting to find out if they're going to get the benefits, to find out when it's going to come. They're left at the whim of people that they maybe don't see now in current remote circumstances. They don't even see them face to face. And if I'm reminded a lot of this at the minute, waiting for appointments, waiting to get a phone call back from the hospital, waiting to get a phone call from the doctor. And I think sometimes, again, there's a lot of research on this. Anticipatory stress is really, really bad for people. That actually, if we know what's happening, we can deal with it. In the last Great Recession, 2008, 2009, there was a real spike in male suicide rates, not just because of the loss of income and the loss of jobs, but also the uncertainty and unpredictability about what was happening. Uncertainty and unpredictability are very hard for people to cope with. And we've developed a lot of systems that are about expecting people to wait to hear what's going to happen. And it contributes to a great deal of anxiety and feelings of lack of control. But the 6 dimensions of poverty that they identified were disempowering systems, structures, and policies. Our welfare system, or for any of you who've watched Daniel Blake, is very, very shaming and shameful at the minute. Universal credit system, you have to wait to get it. You are subject to sanction if you don't meet its requirements, and these can be very blunt instruments. The sanctions can be very harsh. So if you have a hospital appointment and you don't make an appointment at the welfare service, you may be sanctioned. You may be sanctioned if your bus is late. You may be sanctioned if your bus doesn't turn up. All these things that are beyond your control. Stigma, blame, and judgment. We live in a society where the gold standard has been you work and look after yourself, you work and look after your family, and if you don't, it's because there's something wrong with you. And crucially, we've developed a huge issue about taking responsibility. And I always say, whilst it's very important for us as individuals and as moral agents to take responsibility for our behaviours, I've taken responsibility for turning up today and for being prepared and giving you research that, as far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, is accurate and evidence-based and rigorous. However, that's a big step from thinking I should take responsibility for that to thinking I should take responsibility for everything that's happened in my life and for where I've ended up in my life. We are often subject to forces that are way beyond our control in terms of where we're born, what kind of school we go to, what kind of parents we have, what kind of health system we encounter. And some of it is luck, and some of it is about the fact that, 15, 20 years ago, if I'd been a young mom with a baby, I was more than likely to have a Sure Start centre 5 minutes down the road where I could go if I was really struggling, and I could have a cup of tea and I could chat away to people and I could join a parenting group. Today, if I have a baby living in the exact same place, all those sources of family support are gone due to particular government policies. So there are we make our own luck in many ways, but we have a lot of circumstances that combine to render us both either powerful or powerless in particular situations, and it's not all down to us. And there's a lot of stigma, though, attached in a universal way to situations that people find themselves. And crucially, that's why social work, and I listened with intent to the story that you were hearing before, and that was for the social workers with adults, that story you were hearing about the role the social worker can play in listening to people's stories, in abandoning the judgment and hearing why it is that this person is making the decisions they're making in this context and how it makes sense to us or to them, even if we're not sure how it makes sense. Walking in their shoes, and I'll come back to that in terms of poverty aware practice. The other thing that ATD Fourth World talked about was insecurity, financial exclusion, and debt. Massive issues at the minute. our benefit system just is not adequate for meeting our basic needs. And there is quite a lot of very good up-to-date research that shows the shortfall between what we need to survive in any kind of basic way and what people are getting. The state pension is the lowest in Europe, and is really, really, despite the fact that pensioners have been to some extent protected a little from the kind of welfare cuts and have been protected a lot in some ways, actually the basic state pension is extremely poor by international standards. Lack of control was also an issue that I already identified, that lack of control around what you can do, who you can see, and what kind of service you can have. You get what you can take. Damaged health and well-being. And finally, and this is really important, ATD, Fourth World people talked a lot about the fact that their stories weren't heard, and within those stories were incredible stories of bravery, of resilience, of knowledge that was gained about how to survive on a low income, about how to feed children well on a low income, about how to meet your friends in a kind of resilient way without spending a lot of money, have fun without without spending the earth. And so their strengths and their contributions were not part of the assessment framework. So just briefly, I want to acknowledge that that before I move on to how you can work with this, I do want to acknowledge from our research the things that workers have said to us. They said they just feel overwhelmed when they think about poverty. It's just too big. It's way beyond their pay grade, and the problems are too great. And I totally accept that. And one of the things I want us to think about is how we build reflective cultures so that workers can sit with that feeling, and that can sit with kind of like their concerns and their feelings of overwhelmingness. Because my fear is, from research I've done and from research I've seen otherwise, is that when we think things are too big, we can just become blinkered, and we can kind of shut down and become defensive and not be able to engage in an empathic way. So reflective cultures can help us to remain open and to be honest with people. I remember a woman saying to me once, the best social worker I ever had was the one who was most honest with me, who said, I can't do that for you. I won't be able to get you a new house. I absolutely won't, but I can do this for you. And so it's about being honest with ourselves and honest with other people, and naming the kind of discomfort that comes with recognizing the intractability of some of the problems that people are experiencing. The other things that child protection workers have said to me, oh, it's not my job. My job is to assess risk. I will put people in touch with the food bank, but basically my job is to ensure that they learn how to parent properly. Well, as I've always said, and as lots of people have said, we know that children can't concentrate in school if they're if they're hungry. Why on earth would their parents be any different? Finally, there are values linked to wider social and cultural issues. We would be naive to think that the values in our society around othering and stigmatization of people in poverty don't come into our own profession. Of course they do. And I hold my hands up as an educator and say we haven't been doing enough in education to really develop an understanding of poverty with our students, to ensure that they're equipped to understand it, and crucially now, as I move on, to practice in a poverty-aware way. So I'm just going to move on. So the good news is there's lots of ideas around, lots of people trying different things, including in your own area in East Sussex, in children's services and the quality circles work you've been doing. At its very basic, the Maslow hierarchy of needs work is being used to attend to people's practical needs, to make sure CPAG have done a lot of work on this. Okay, you don't understand about benefits, but you know somebody else who does. You know how to ensure that people are getting the help they can, and to make sure that they're getting all that they can. And that can really help. A little bit of extra income, according to the research, can make a massive difference to well-being. It's extraordinary how important it can be, according to the research. So start with the basics. We know that some local authorities have integrated their financial help services into their broader offer, and so it is a matter. It's just default position, that people get offered that as part of. And hopefully, if we are developing this program around family help, that we will be doing that as part of the family help offer. In adult services, I think there's probably been more awareness for some time around the importance of practical help. Child protection seems to have gone down more of an individualized psychological road, but I think that adult services have been better on this for some time. And certainly colleagues in mental health have been, from my observations of their work. Good news is there are now a whole range of frameworks for practice, from the Baswell one right through to work you've been doing in East Sussex yourself, helping people to think about, and some of those have been developed with the work in a co-produced way. We've been doing some work on tips for supervisors, how to help people in supervision, help get workers to think about families, to think about them in a holistic way, and not to just resort to jargon like, well, she's not committed to meeting the kids' needs, or she prioritizes her own needs over the children. Drilling down, unpacking that, hearing the whole story. What is life like on this street for this person? Who do they talk to? Who do they go to for help? What's it like to be a Black lone dad in this community? What's the bus service like? What's the how do you get from place to place? I have been, again, reflecting on my own situation, really shocked at how little I've been asked about how I got to the hospital, and it's quite a trek from one part of where I live to the other to get there. 2 trains and a bus it would require. I have access to a car, I'm okay, but so 2 trains and a bus. Trains are really notoriously bad. We've northern trains up here, they're notoriously bad. So getting to services, who looks after you, and crucially, we know that things are really, really bad in many places in terms of access to primary care. But also we do know, and this is the importance of the resilience. Again, I've got lots of examples of people linking up across councils and with the third sector. And so I want to say to us on World Social Work Day, as social workers, we need to think about our history. Our history has been as networkers, as communicators, as navigators. We've never just been about what happens in this house with these families in this particular context. We got narrowed down partly because of child protection deaths. We got narrowed down because of the moral panics around a particular model of child protection. And we know that across adult and services and across the life course, social work is much, much more exciting and vibrant than that. And our history shows that. So I just wanted to end really with a plea that if we are to be serious about poverty-aware practice across the life course, we need to build on our strengths of thinking holistically and dynamically. We need to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to apply at every stage of the life course. Why are we so focused on the needs of the child and the young person? Partly because it's an old economistic idea. They're the future labour force, so we'll invest in them to build the global economy of tomorrow, as Gordon Brown used to say. But aging is just as valuable part of the life course. Older people make incredible contributions to families and have made incredible contributions to families. They have the same needs at every stage of the life course as the young child. And so finally, because I love these little things that I make up for myself, for me, it's about connecting and making connections, connecting the dots, connecting the links between mental health of parents with disability of a grandparent, with the struggles that a young child might be having in school and with being cared for, connecting the dots between fuel poverty, period poverty and food poverty, and making connections. Crucially, I would argue making connections with our public health colleagues who really do know a lot about how inequalities play out across the life course. So thank you very much. I think I've taken 43 minutes, which might be a little over. I do apologize if that is so, but we do have a bit of time, I think.
That's fine. We were ready for you to carry on until 10 to. So
oh, fine. Oh, that's great. Well, that's
I'm
even
sorry
better.
that you felt strangulated in
No,
your
not
timing
at all.
there. Sorry.
I always think it's better to speak less than more,
Okay,
to be honest.
that's really great. Okay, well, firstly, just to say thank you so much. That couple of times that I've met you, I found what your message, both just in those brief conversations, both challenging and oddly makes me very emotional. So I'm just being honest there. That's my initial reaction to just hearing what you had to say. I'd be really interested to know whether anyone else has any comments or thoughts that they would like to say. And obviously, if you have any questions, what I'm going to do is in a moment, I'm going to come to Children's Services and ask whether or not Nicola's got questions from our colleagues over in another part of the world, and then we'll take any questions from adult services and just keep kind of swapping over if there's any questions or comments that people would like to make. I'm just going to make a comment myself, if that's okay, just to get people started. But I think from an adult social care perspective, I mean, I know, Brid, that where this has kind of been born from, if you excuse the irony of that, is from looking at children, and that's kind of the point you were making. And I think it's been really helpful to hear you adjust your thinking and in terms of how that looks across the board. And I could feel you kind of making sure that you were kind of pulling that and balancing it out in terms of what you were saying. But I think in particular, the silos issue that you talked about, it really resonates for me to recognise that, having worked in adult social care, adult services, adult social work, all of my social work career, and before, when I was working as kind of a home care worker and everything else, that there was often a kind of, well, that's about children's services, this is about adult services, that's health, this is mental health, this is, that there were already those kind of silos. And yet, of course, the irony is that our colleagues that are on this call, and also people that are out there who couldn't make it today, will be going out today to visit an older person where there is a child in the property, where they are concerned about children that aren't in the property, that are living elsewhere in the country, where they've obviously been children, they've moved into adulthood. We've got whole families that we're visiting, but we're particularly focused on the adult. And in the same way that our adult services colleagues are working with, by default, parents who are adults, and also with each other. So it's kind of recognizing our experience of kind of the impact of poverty, say, and other elements on who we are, as well as on who we're visiting in the course of our work. So it's really struck me to really have another think about that, because I do think that we have some kind of cut-offs that kind of, to some extent, it's our get out of jail card, is that, oh, that's not about me, that's for someone else to deal with. And in some ways that's right, but in other ways it misses those connections, those dots are not so easily connected. That was a very long short point, sorry. So on that note, I'm going to go over to Nicola and just say, Nicola, do you have a question for Brid, please?
I do. Would you be pleased to know that the first question is a fairly straightforward one, so start it fairly straightforward. Okay. Yes, I can. So the first question is a fairly straightforward question, and it's for Brid. So, one piece of advice for a newly qualified social worker when working in an anti-poverty way.
Yes, that's a lovely question. Thank you. I think, don't be embarrassed, ashamed, be proud of being very practical. Be proud of starting from the very basic things, like, what, does this person have enough food? Have they enough income? Have they enough? What's their housing like? There are things you can't do anything about, but there are things you can do. But I think, again, Sharon's right, my background's all in child protection and stuff, but my experience in child protection has been that we've kind of wanted to be very experts and to be almost mini psychologists. And I was talking to my students about this last week, and I was saying, be very proud of knowing about attachment theory, be very proud about knowing about trauma, but be equally proud of knowing who they can go to make sure that they have enough food and that they have enough income. So that's what I would say to a beginning social worker. Be holistic.
Thank you. So Sharon, I think it's over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is there anyone in adult services who at this point has a question for Brid, or anything, any comments that they would like to make about what they've just heard?
Somebody called Michael.
Michael Cotter.
I'm
Michael
always
Cotter. I'm
trouble.
so pleased that Michael's on the call. He's always got a comment. I love it.
Good.
Michael,
No.
over to you.
I was going to say thank you very much for that. And it does make sense that poverty affects the whole life course. And if we don't advocate more for people to try and make changes, poverty affects every aspect of life. And you did talk about Royal Holloway. I went to Royal Holloway, so I have quite an affinity to Royal Holloway University, and I know that was one of the things on the course was all about the person in the environment and how, and it wasn't just the environment, it was everything around them. So if there's not good health, not good housing, it affects their whole life. So it can, the person's position in society, as you mentioned, class, does make a big difference, and it's poverty. It could be education. If education is not up to the standard, or the schools don't have enough resources, a bit like adult social care or children's services, people remain in poverty, and it affects their position in society and how they progress. So thank you for that. It really has made sense, I hope, to a lot of younger people. But for me, as one of the sort of older generation, as you'd say, I'm hitting that age where it makes a lot more sense. If that.
Yeah. Oh,
but
good.
thank you very much.
I work a lot with people in Royal Holloway. I'll feed back to them that they still that you still remember what they said to you. And can I just give an example of, again, because people will be sitting there going, oh, but you know, what can I do about housing or whatever? I accompanied it's a very voluntary thing. I'm an advocate for somebody who's going through, or support, or whatever you'd like to call it, for someone who's going through the child protection system at the minute, a parent, a young woman. And so I was there when the social worker visited recently. God love the social worker. She took one look at me and said, oh my God, you used to teach me, and started, anyway, she said, I feel like I'm being observed. We actually had a lovely visit, but I was really impressed with one thing. One thing was around housing. It is an issue for this particular young woman. And the social worker was really honest about the housing situation in the borough that we live in, or that I don't live in it, but they live in, and that it was just not going to be possible to move her, to get her a house. But she immediately, we started talking about how we could make this housing situation a bit better for this. So it was, again, not dismissing and saying this is, or not even asking about it, but it was, yes, so she can't sort out and get a new house, but she can help her to think about how she could make this housing situation a bit more suitable. So again, it's that kind of practical thing. Yeah. Can I just say something, Sharon, about being emotional? Because I think one of the things that if I would have talked about, and that does raise a lot of issues, and I haven't thought about it so much in terms of poverty, but of course it is linked to poverty. I'm working in a poverty aware practice. In nursing, there is this term called moral distress. And people also talk about moral injury. And in fact, during the strikes, paramedics have been talking about moral injury. And moral distress and moral injury refer to the disjuncture between how you want to work and how you actually are working. And a lot of people are really struggling with moral distress at the minute. And I wanted to just say that around what might be happening for workers on this call, that actually they're listening to me and they're thinking, well, I want to work like this, but I can't. I haven't got the ability to work like this. And I think we need to name that, and then think about how we can help people to move. You know, we can't magic up houses for people. We can't magic up loads of income for them. But what can we do? What can we do? We can recognize it, and then we can work in practical ways to alleviate stuff. So, and we did during COVID, particularly. We did lots of that during COVID. So again, I just wanted to name that.
Thank you, Brid, and thank you, Michael, as well. I think yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it, about how what you hear and then how it affects you might actually be why you you come into this work in the first
Exactly.
place anyway. So it's both a pull push kind of experience. So, but that's probably about reflecting as well, isn't it? It's about how immediately starting to sort of digest it, to think about how it might actually impact you and the work that you do. So okay, so we've started to get lots of questions in adult services, so you better be ready, children's services, because we've got we're starting to get a few people wanting to ask a few things. So back over to children's services.
Actually, Sharon, Kathy Marriott, who's our assistant director, is on the call with you, and I've just seen her put up her hand, so maybe Kathy wants to ask the next question.
We'll let you, Kathy, we'll let you jump over to ask a question.
You are the boss.
Well, I don't want to jump over anybody. Hi, Bridget. I don't know if you remember me. I haven't seen you for years. It's really great to catch up with you. And
I always
be
think about
Connemara,
Kathy. Connemara. Us Irish, you know, we always recognise each other. Hi, Michael, as well.
We enjoyed the rugby at the weekend.
Oh my God, it was amazing. Best thing that's happened for ages.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a few reflections from me, really. I mean, I think for me, some of the key messages coming out were around kind of that whole family approach, the intersectionality. And you know, I've long been a big advocate of the social model to child protection. I just feel we pathologize individual families, and actually what we need to be looking at is that kind of wider community support. And I'm particularly struck by kind of how we can feel helpless in these kind of situations. And I think that key message around practical support, like what can you do, what actually physically can we undertake as, you know, social workers, as early help family workers, you know, as adult social workers in engaging in practical support. I just think that's really key, and I think it actually helps a bit with that kind of moral distress as well, if you're pragmatically doing something. So my question was around how far do you think that the proposed children's social care reforms help us on this journey? So I'm just intrigued in terms of your thinking around that, Bridget.
I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. Of course, you know, as a long-time advocate of family support, I'm delighted to see family help up there. But and I hope I'm not being too negative here. I don't want to be too negative, but it's really interesting. We discussed this at the teaching partnership that I'm part of last week, and we were going to try and write a response because we were thinking about it as workers and as academics together. You know, I think family help should be available as a universal thing, and it should be available in a non-stigmatizing help. And we do know, don't we, from the evaluations of Sure Start, that it did work. I saw it work in practice. I was a critical friend to a Sure Start for 5 years. I saw how it worked in people's lives, and now the robust evaluations have shown some very good outcomes, particularly around health. So I think the family help offer is a bit too narrow, and but what I'm really worried about is, because I want it to work, is all the recommendations for training are again around the child protection side and around this expert group of people over there. Because for me, and I have thought for years, we do child protection all the time, every day in family help, and they're now saying, well, they want them to work with domestic abuse, for example. Well, where's the help and support and training for all that? It's very odd. It's not well thought through around the relationship between family help and child protection. There's a crisis in the workforce. You know that better than me. From my end, yesterday it was announced that the bursaries for social work education are going to stay frozen. They've been frozen since 2014. And so the inequalities in terms of who's coming into the workforce and what they're coming in with remain. You know, people are really struggling to come into our profession now. We get the students I'll stop in a minute. We get the students at Huddersfield who are the first in the family to go to university. They're from ethnic minority backgrounds often, and they're often lone parents. And they are really struggling with the bursary. And then they're coming in with debt. And that feeds into very practical problems for you, because They will go on to agency jobs if it's tricky, because it'll pay better in the short term. They'll be able to pay off some of their debts, etc. So I think it didn't tackle some of the fundamental questions around resourcing our workforce, and then the training. And the 5-year thing, I'm not sure. I think it's tinkering at the edges with a lot of stuff. But then am I just critical academic? I want a good universal offer for families, and I want a good we have to acknowledge in the report, the main report that came out from Josh McAllister really talked about poverty and inequality, didn't it? It really talked about the contribution poverty and inequality make to families' lives and families' problems, and that of course got all diluted in this. The section on we've been thinking about this. We looked at the section on poverty in the government's response, and actually it's really challenging, as in it's saying you should be aware of poverty, but that almost turns it into a problem for the social workers again. It's your fault you're not aware of poverty, and turns it into another character defect. You're not being trained to be aware of poverty. Well, actually, as we say, it's not just about being aware, it's about what you do with it, and have you got the resources to do with it. So yeah, sorry, that's a bit garbled.
Thank you, Brid, and thank you, Kathy. I do like the thing, am I just a critical academic? And probably most of us were thinking yes and good. This is what we need. So thank you about that. So I'm going to take it back into adult services again, and our next question, our next comment is from Samantha Cullen. Hiya, Sam.
Hello. Well, my parents are Irish, so I want to be part of the gang. Is that all right? Just back at like what Sharon said really about the emotional side of things, and how it's not a question really, it's just made me reflect as you're talking about, when you said simple things, you said something about the simple thing about picking up a flower. And I work in older people's mental health, and many people are in residential care homes, and the dementia units are on the top floors and not having free access outside, which I think the law should be changed about that. But that's just something so simple and so beautiful when you say something so simple in life. And also when you were saying about poverty killing dreams, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? Because we all work and try and just like go on holiday and buy things, and we're in warm houses, etc. And it's just a bit of a reality thing when you said that. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you, Samantha. And it is emotional, actually. You're absolutely right. It is emotional to think about. Yeah. But on the dementia thing, my mother-in-law has dementia and is in a care home near us. And she is on the ground floor. I didn't know that people with dementia had to be on top floor. She is on the ground floor.
Do you know, most homes I go in, I would say there's probably about 3 homes I know where they have free flow into the garden. Okay. And most dementia units are on the top floor. Okay. Which is like I say, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, of course.
But the other thing I just sort of also wanted to add is that when you said about, I mean, when people are ringing in and they're in like a pending tray and they haven't got an appointment, and they're sort of, you might get allocated next week. Oh no, it might be 3 weeks time. But having that definite date is something I'll be bringing forward to my team, really, because I do think you're in limbo, aren't you, when you're not sure when you're going to be seen. It causes, like you say, additional stress and anxiety. Yeah. So yeah, thank you again for that.
Polly Toynbee, the Guardian journalist, wrote a book many years ago. I think it was called Hard Work, where she, a lot of journalists have done this, where she took time to just, I took time out of her journalist job, and she just claimed benefits, lived in social housing, etc. And one thing she talked a lot about was time. How, if you're an important person, your time is respected. Oh, I won't keep you waiting, and blah, blah, blah. Whereas poor people were just assumed to have indefinite time and were kept waiting all the time. She just noticed that. Yeah, no, it's true. Again, going back to my experience of accompanying the young woman on the visit, I was so impressed with the way the social worker gave definite times about when she would ring back and when she would be available, and explaining when she would have her phone off and stuff. She was very attentive to that. Yeah, which was really impressive. Again, that's kind of looked very simple, basic stuff that we can do. We can say to people, I will have my phone off for a lot of tomorrow, but I will ring you back when I said I would, I promise you.
About honesty again, isn't it? Or
Yeah,
openness, or transparency,
Yeah.
and kind of, you say, calling out what the situation is. So
Yeah.
okay, so thank you for that, Sam. Right, so I'm conscious it's coming up to 5 past, so I'm going to go back to children's services, and then we've got lots of people that are in the adult service, or certainly on the call. We probably won't get to everyone, because we're going to finish around 10 past. So what I'm going to ask is, if you've got anything you want to add into the chat, then do. And what Britta's actually very kindly said is that any further questions or comments she's happy to respond to after the event. But we were conscious not to be online for too long, so as that people don't have a sort of online distress for having been on here for too long. So I'm going to go back to children's services and get another question from our colleagues over there.
Thank you, Sharon. This is a slightly more complex question, but it sort of relates to what you were saying about the government's response to the care crisis, and it's from our colleague Patricia Jackson. To what extent does political ideology impact on the continuation of poverty in society? And a really interesting point, should politics be included in social work education? It's a goodie, isn't it?
Well, on the latter point, I thought that, oh no, this is a very flip remark. I'll say that in a minute. Of course, politics matters inevitably. I have seen throughout my career the political choices that have been made. I was at a conference last week with Child Poverty Action Group, and they were tracing how the numbers of children in poverty went up and down depending on the policy. So policies really matter, actually, really make a difference. We took nearly 1 million children out of poverty under the last Labour administrations, and so policies and politics really matter, and that's why we need to carefully look at what people are saying they're going to do when it comes to the general election around poverty. It's a choice. It's a choice where we spend our money. Should politics be taught on courses? Good question. I mean, there's a huge issue about. The reason I laughed there was, some of you might possibly remember in 2012 when Michael Gove made the speech where he said that social work educators were filling their students' minds up with ideas that, paraphrase, he said basically that we were telling the students that if parents were mistreating their children, it wasn't their fault. It was because they were victims of poverty and inequality. And I remember reading that, and I was doing loads of research with families at the time, and I was thinking, well, we're making a spectacularly poor job of it, because none of the families I'm meeting or the social workers I'm meeting are doing this. We're really inept. But I also knew we weren't doing it. I think that we should be teaching philosophy and critical thinking in social work, and that doesn't mean, I think, if politics is part of that, we need to produce people who are kind, humane, and able to critically think about their families and about their lives, and are able to interrogate things and be reflective and inquiring, and we should be teaching those skills. One of the worries I have, we're looking at Huddersfield, we have a 4-year degree, so they end up with an MA at the end of it, so we've quite a lot of time with them. But the 3-year degree is really crammed. So people are just getting, you need to learn about child sexual exploitation, you need to learn about this, you need to learn about that. Whereas what we need to teach are the skills, so that when new social problems come up, they have the ability to understand them. So critical thinking skills, we definitely need to be thinking about. We need to be teaching, definitely. And history, we need to teach the history. I used to love teaching history.
Back to Olive Stevenson.
Yeah,
and the comments there.
Did anyone remember Olive Stevenson out of interest?
I've met Olive Stevenson several times, actually, due to a job I had once, and she was an amazing person, and it was really nice to hear you speaking about her. I often think that we don't recognize figures and figureheads in social work, and I think it's really nice to have that, because it gives us a place to go to kind of explore what someone who we respect, or who maybe is a sort of mentor, maybe something that you can go to actually like find out what they thought, so that you can kind of bounce your ideas off, even if they're not around anymore, to actually ask directly.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, really good. Now, okay, so I'm conscious we've got basically 2 minutes, so I'm going to say to Saburo that you're the last person to speak, and anyone else who's still got their hands up, I'm really sorry, or questions that we've got in children's services, please do add them either to the chat, or we'll get them forwarded to you, Brid. I hope it won't be too many pages,
Okay,
but
don't worry.
we'll get you some more questions. So over to you, Saburo.
Oh, hello. Thanks for the presentation. It was really good. I'm currently a third-year student, and I'm in the older adults mental health team on placement at the moment. But I was reflecting on what you said about the Chancellor talking about independence as a desirable, but as a very sort of politically loaded term, as you know, independence as being not dependent on us for anything, and how that links to the work we do with assessments, where quite, you know, and I've done it myself, where sometimes there's a shorthand where you're filling in the assessment and you say that somebody desires to remain independent, or the point is for them to remain independent, where it just made me think about, is being interdependent is sometimes more important than being independent. And if somebody has, you know, very dire poverty, you know, and is in a very dire state, you know, how, you know, is independence actually a desirable thing for themselves? So that need to be more holistic, and to sort of drill down on what it actually means, and not just say somebody wants to remain independent because one person's independence is so different to what I might sort of come in thinking is a desirable thing, and how much things like the Care Act might be politically influenced as, you know, keep people independent, i.e. not being a drain on services. So it just made me sort of think about that.
Great point, actually. Oh God, we could have a whole philosophical discussion about dependence and interdependence. And yeah, I mean, I think often politicians define independence as being about not going for benefits and not being reliant upon the state. Whereas you're absolutely right. We are interdependent. You know, from the day we're born till the day we die, we give and receive care at different levels all through. You know, all of us today are here with clothes that have been made by somebody, having eaten a breakfast that was probably made by somebody else or produced by somebody else. The nature of human condition, as we're finding with climate change, is that actions made in one place have implications for people many miles away. We are interdependent as human beings. Independence in terms of like not feeling independence, as in feeling some sense of control over your life, or having voice or agency, is really, really important. It's really important. But to define independence in such a narrow way as you have to look after yourself absolutely completely is just not. It denies the reality of the human condition.
Okay,
really good point, though. Thank you. Yeah,
I like that. So that's a brilliant one to finish on, and one of our current students. It's really lovely to hear you speaking. Thank you so much for putting that forward. So on that note, we're a minute over, which is actually not bad for my chairing, because I'm usually really, really bad. And I just want to say thank you, Brid, again for being with us this morning. And thank you to all of you for listening and hopefully absorbing some of the information that Brid has given to us this morning. We will forward her presentation once when she's in a position to share that with us. And it's just really, Brid, to say thank you really so much. I think it's been a really great way of I don't know, stopping and thinking, and giving us some time to think about something that's really practical in our day-to-day practice. So thank you so much for what you've done this morning. What will happen after this is that we will, children's services and adult services are going to have a 10-minute break, which means that we'll come back. I'll be back on the call at 11:20, and adult services will remain virtual, and children's services will go back to their in-person event. So on that note, I just want to say thank you to children's services, and it's really nice just to connect with you for a short while. and hope you have a good rest of the session together. And thank you again from all of us on behalf of everyone to Brid for your time and input today.
And can I just say, I'm not responding to the chat because of my typing problems, but just to say thank you to everyone. Thank you. Lovely to see you, Kathy. I'm not singling out Kathy. It's just we made a connection a few years ago and I haven't seen her because of damned COVID, but hopefully it might happen again. Thank you, everyone. Really, really appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully we'll continue to talk to each other, Nicola, and to continue.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's lovely
Okay.
to see you.
Lovely to see you all.
Thank you very much. See you,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Bye.
So see you everyone.